We are very excited to have this session, what future for higher education learning in hopefully what we hope will become a post-pandemic world, or at least a world where we will be able to rely on digital tools because of choice and not necessarily because of force, because we are not capable of meeting in presence. So we're very happy to have this panel before you here. As you see, Dale Jensen from Arizona State University, Sukaina Walji from the University of Cape Town in South Africa, and Blanaid White from Dublin City University in Ireland. They all work in the field of looking at innovation in teaching and learning. So we're very pleased to have all three of you here today and go into this conversation about how can we now distill some lessons learned that we have taken from this time of pandemic, where we were forced to rely on digital tools in order to continue teaching and learning, and what are the things that we want to maintain and keep, and what do we want to do differently moving forward. These are really some of the questions that we want to debate here today. So with no further ado, oh yes, I just have one thing that I wanted to share as well before we go ahead. We did a very little poll just asking where you are situated in the university, to have a short idea. So please share with us very quickly what part of the university you're part of. I'll just keep it open for a minute. I think it will not take you too long to respond to it, so that we can see what audience. But typically we do have a very mixed audience here at IAU, because we reached out to the higher education institutions at large, very often working with the leadership, but on some topics, of course, with faculty and teaching staff, on other topics on administrations. And we always try, of course, to keep the student voice represented as well. So many different stakeholders, but all within the higher education community. So let's see, I think that most of you were able to respond to the poll. So let me see, I think I will close it here and I will share the results. Do you see the results on the screen? Very good. So yeah, we do have a majority of other still, but otherwise more than 20% faculty and teaching staff, and then a few students as well. And then we have all the different categories well represented. So thank you for sharing that with us. I think that gives us already an idea of who is with us here today. And again, welcome to all of you. I think that we will turn to the first presentations. What we're going to do here today is that we will ask each of our panelists to a bit explain their view on the future of higher education learning, looking at their experience, of course, in the universities that they're based in the context that they're based in, and then their own vision for the future, or maybe aspirations. I think that would be very interesting. So each of them will get 10 to 15 minutes to introduce that, and then we will turn to a discussion, and I hope that all of you will pose a lot of questions. If you can use the Q&A function, please do that. It will be easier for me to review, but I will also try to follow the chat as we move along. So that will be the format of today. So please do send in all your questions, and we'll try to have a very interactive sessions towards the end. Let me start now by introducing our first speaker. So Dale Jensen is the Director of Digital Innovation for the University Design Institute at Arizona State University in the US. He has been there almost for 10 years, I believe, and he works with the university leaders to develop and implement digital solutions to enable student success. But beyond his experience in ACU, he has a long track record on this field. So we are looking very much forward to learning from you, Dale, and to hear what are your thoughts about the future of higher education, teaching and learning. You have the floor.
Thank you for the invitation and the opportunity to share this platform with colleagues from other distinguished universities. I want to start by saying I'm glad there are a number of students here as well, because it'll be interesting to hear your feedback and your questions regarding the future of teaching and learning as well. I think that the challenge is to be inclusive at this moment in time so that we hear the voices of all of the potential participants in this learning process. As mentioned, I'm the Director of Digital Innovation at the University Design Institute at Arizona State University. We are a large public research university, the largest single university in the United States with over 140,000 students now. And I want to note that almost half of our students are entirely online. This was before the pandemic. And what we've done over the last 10 years is built out the instructional infrastructure to support the digital transformation. So I think that I'll be speaking from a perspective of our experience building this infrastructure to support the future of learning. The university is quite famous in the United States for being #1 in innovation for the past 7 years in a row. We're very proud of this fact because we've invested a great deal in developing an innovative culture and supporting the digital transformation process through our staff development, our faculty development, our student participation, and our investment in technology. We at the University Design Institute are working all over the world. I'm currently working in Kazakhstan, in Mexico, in Brazil, in Uruguay, and in Vietnam. So I've seen a lot of different challenges, different perspectives. We also have a large project in Africa now with 10 universities there. So it's an exciting time to be involved in this discussion of digital transformation. I'm leading the Digital Transformation Initiative, and our goal is to help our colleagues all over the world thrive in this changing digital educational environment. We look at a number of different factors in this process, from leadership through partnerships. And what we try to do is to provide perspective and information and research on how to help you succeed in your digital transformation. Now, I like to start with this quote because Buckminster Fuller is quite a famous architect and futurist. And I think he captured the challenge we face. We're not going to change things by fighting the existing reality. To change something, we have to build a new model. And that's what we're here to talk about today. What is the new model for digital education? And that's how we will make the existing model obsolete. One of the frustrations, I think, when we're all working in this space is how persistent the existing culture is. It has been around for a long time and it doesn't change easily. There is some value to that. Obviously, having tradition and culture is good, but we also have to think about how can we open that up to a new model. Because what we're doing now is we are struggling to win the attention of our students. Over the past 15 years, we've seen an explosion of devices and access to Wi-Fi and the internet. And what we found is that we've lost control of the classroom experience. We can't simply close the door anymore and expect everything to be in that environment, in that teaching environment. So as the environment has changed, we have to think about changing. Today, our classrooms look more like this, where every student is bringing a device. It's really impossible to monitor all of this activity. And what we've discovered is adding technology is not the solution. If the model is not working, adding more technology is not going to improve it. In this case, you see, here's a student who's actually looking at baby pictures during the class. And this classroom is completely filled with technology. Every student has their computer, there's projection systems, there's audiovisual systems. So as we think about how we want to build a new model, we have to take all this into consideration. Because we've really been using the same model for over 2,000 years. The one thing that the Greeks gave us was the amplification technology, the ability for one person to speak to thousands using this design of physical space. So the amphitheater has become our de facto teaching technology. And we no longer need this. We have amplification technology now. We have all the other technologies that we're familiar with. So we continue to use the 2,000-year-old technology because that's what we think is natural. But I'm here to tell you it's not natural and it's not normal. and it's not necessary any longer. So what we want to talk about here is how do we think about changing this and not letting our environment dictate our teaching pedagogy. So we've been working on this for over a decade at Arizona State University under a hybrid learning program that I led. The challenge initially was improving the results in our science, technology, engineering, and math courses. So you see biology, chemistry, algebra, college math. But we also discovered that it works for the literature and history and the social sciences. So we started doing psychology, history, philosophy, and the hybrid model worked equally well. Now I'm going to spend the rest of my time describing that model and talking about how we implemented it for our faculty. I like to start that conversation with a little bit of background. Hopefully you're familiar with Bloom's taxonomy. This is a shorthand model for different approaches to teaching and the learning process. Benjamin Bloom designed this model back in the early 80s. And what I've found over time is we've been trapped in lower level Bloom's activities. We've been focused almost entirely on remembering and understanding, because often we didn't have time in our classroom experience to get to application, analysis, evaluation, or creativity. This has been frustrating for faculty as well as students. And what we've done with our hybrid model is we've changed the activities that we employ in order to get to the teaching. So we do all of the basic low-level Bloom's instruction online, which frees up time in the classroom to focus on higher order thinking. And this is where the transformation occurs. So I will dive into this now and give you a little bit more practical explanation of what this means. For a student, it means that they do their information acquisition and knowledge acquisition online. We record all of the video lectures. We place all of the reading material. We put in all of the simulations in our learning management system. Then we also build formative assessment into that model. And the formative assessment can be in the form of practice problems or a quiz or some kind of interactive exercise. That is designed to generate data. And the data that flows to the professor can then be used to guide what is the higher order thinking. So now we're in the classroom again, and we're working on problem solving. So we've developed interactive exercises that students do in small teams in the classroom. And the final step in this process is assimilating all of that knowledge into the students' understanding of the subject. That can be done online or in the classroom, again, using exercises or activities like a writing assignment after the classroom workshop is done. The students have a writing assignment that they have to submit within 2 days. These are the processes that allow us to create a hybrid model that makes the old lecture model obsolete. And the good thing about this is it's familiar to our faculty and to our students. This is an example of a hypothetical biology course. And what you'll notice is that every week there's another theme that the professor decides to focus on. And that allows them to build the interactive exercises and all of the instructional resources around that theme. There are still laboratories. We still have exams, very traditional exams in class. And this process is something that the faculty and the students can adapt to relatively easily. Now, what that means in a practical sense is we have to help our faculty record all of their lectures. We built that instructional infrastructure, as I mentioned, because we were recording the lectures for online students anyway. And our online students never come to campus. So we have essentially two benefits. When we record a lecture, we use it for our online students and we use it for our hybrid students so that they also get the benefit. The second piece is creating these formative assessments, and these go into our learning management system. they generate data for the professor, and then the professor can identify individuals who need assistance. This is really important because what we're doing for the first time is we're creating an environment where the professor knows more about the student's work and the student's understanding before the exam. We don't want to discover after the first examination that the student didn't understand any of the material. So we're looking for tools like this that will support the hybrid model and create more information for the professor to utilize. Once we're in class, we stop lecturing. This is a very important piece of the model. If the professor continues to lecture, the students won't do the prep work online. So we have to have a strict rule within this transformation process that there are no more lectures. Now, that doesn't mean that a faculty member can't explain something. And they often have short explanations, maybe 5 minutes explaining a particular exercise or a particular piece of data, but we don't want them talking for 50 minutes and having the students be passive, because our ultimate goal is to do interactive exercises. We had to redesign our instructional environment. Our classrooms now look more like this. We have flat floors, round tables. Students work in small teams of 6. They have access to their computers. They have audiovisual systems in the room. There are microphones for the students and for the teachers so that everyone can hear everyone else. And when we change this environment, we're able to change the pedagogy and we're able to change the learning experience. So for us, this is the ultimate goal, to get into the classroom and do more interactive work. When we did this, we found that there were 2 big benefits. The first was in the hybrid model, when we implemented in 2015, we used the same instructor, the same curriculum, and the same assessment so we could do this comparison. We have a tremendous problem historically with our withdrawal rate. And what that means is a student pays for the class but does not receive a final grade. And in the United States, at Arizona State in particular, that might be as much as $1,500. So a student has paid upfront, but not completed the classwork and does not receive a grade. So in this case, you'll see that 20% of the students in this Introduction to Biology class did not complete in spring of 2015. That number dropped to less than 2% when we implemented the hybrid model. Now, the faculty developed a hypothesis about this. They speculated that the use of the team projects and the interactive exercises has actually created a social network for our students. And that social network has strengthened their bond and their relationship to the learning process. So they're less likely to drop out when they have these teammates that they're working with. The second piece of data we look at is what's the success rate of the students, and that's a grade of A, B, or C in our system. In this case, you can see it increased by 22 percentage points. And what we found there when we looked at the data was having access to all of the instructional resources online meant that students could repeat the learning process. So they watched the video more than one time. Now, in this case, while I'm speaking, if you're trying to take notes and you miss something, it's gone forever. But thankfully, we're recording this webinar, so you could come back and you can replay the webinar and you can see what you missed the first time. So this technique has added a lot of value in the learning process, and that's why we call it transformative. Now, when we talk about liberating the faculty and the students from lecture, we really want to focus on using that to do new things. And those new things include developing professional abilities. In our professional world, we work on collaborative teams. I may be working on 20 different teams right now with all of my colleagues all over the world. And I have to learn how to work with different cultures, with different personalities, with different backgrounds. I also have to learn to communicate effectively with my colleagues and to think critically with them. I have to learn how to be positive and proactive and offer suggestions for improvement, and develop those skills in a professional manner. And ultimately, this is about being creative. We want our students to be problem solvers, and we want them to go into the professional world with confidence. So building these kinds of professional abilities adds a lot of value, in addition to learning biology, learning chemistry, learning physics. So they're adding new skills on top of the existing knowledge. Instructors do have to change what they've done over time. So when we think about what's the new role and responsibility of a professor, well, they have to create and configure all of this material. And that takes time. We have to support them. It's like building a new building. They have to rethink the entire foundation of their instruction. So we have to provide support, because they're going to design new learning experiences. They're going to use learning analytics. They have to learn how to diagnose these problems before the exam. They're going to provide individual instruction. Once they understand that a student doesn't know the material, they have to have a plan of action to help that student. And they have to learn how to lead students through problem-solving exercises. That's not necessarily a natural thing. When I was in school in the 1980s, everything was lecture, and a professor had learned how to lecture by participating as a student and then going through training as a graduate student and a doctoral student. In our world, we still have many professors who've only lectured their entire career. So transforming that to a problem-solving model in a different classroom takes time. And we've discovered that we have to help the professors learn these new skills as well. So we do that by surrounding the faculty members with support. We've developed teams of instructional designers, technologists. We even use vendor personnel, people who are providing the technology for the course in order to support the team. We use graphic designers. We have video producers. We have learning analysts, people who can look at the data and help a professor diagnose a problem. That, again, is not a natural skill. So bringing all of these experts into this conversation is an important part of the process. And finally, we talk about leadership. Leaders are critical to the success of this endeavor. I found at Arizona State University that we had to align 4 levels of leadership. We had to have faculty leaders. We had to have our department chair leading this process. We had to have our dean for the college involved in leading, and we had to have the provost. All 4 of those people are critical to the success of this process. And the final analysis of all of this is that it's a team sport. We are not playing a solo sport anymore. It's not an individual professor in the classroom. It's a team of experts supporting the professor in this transformation process. And you have to think creatively about how you can support your colleagues. And the process has been underway for some time. This is not a new model. The hybrid model has been around for 25 or 30 years now. And what we're finding is it's just getting to scale. So bringing on all of these professors and providing them with support takes time and money. And we're just getting over what the innovative thinkers call the chasm, which is where you can say we're scaling naturally. And professors are participating with excitement and with creativity. So as we think about this, hopefully you're joining the early adopters now, and you'll be part of the early majority to make this the model that makes lecture obsolete. And one of the last things I like to close with is this quote from Alan Kay: "The best way to predict the future is to invent it." So I want to challenge each of you to invent your future. Think about this transformation in your context, in your culture, with your colleagues, and invent a future that works for your students. Because we know that we can't continue to use the obsolete model when the technology is available and the transformation is possible. So I'll pause there and look forward to questions after the others present.
Thank you very much, Dale, for taking us through this very interesting presentation that really gives us an idea of the transformation that you have been leading with your colleagues at the Arizona State University. It's fascinating, I find, to see, particularly because we come out of this period where we've been forced to rely on digital technologies, but also somewhat feeling isolated at some times at home. But what I get from your model is really that you try to think differently about time and make sure that you use the technologies then for the lecturing part, or for transferring the knowledge, so that you can actually make the experience on campus even more social than it was before. So actually trying to use the strengths of the different spaces when you teach. So thank you very much for sharing that experience with us. And for the participants, please do go ahead and send in your questions to Dale. We'll take them a little bit later, but do not forget about them. I'm now going to make you travel to Africa, and more specifically to South Africa, because we are also very pleased to have Sukaina Walji with us here. And Sukaina, she's the director of the Center for Innovation in Teaching and Learning at the University of Cape Town in South Africa. She sees the operational functions of the centers and provides strategic advice for university senior leadership for digitally enabled education, focusing both on online education, curriculum and course design, and of course supporting the center in continuously developing its capacity in designing and developing blended as well as online solutions. So Sukaina, we're very much looking forward to now diving into the context of South Africa, and most particularly your university, to learn what is happening in your context and how you see the future of learning.
Thank you very much, Trine. Good afternoon, everybody, or good morning, or good evening, wherever you are. It's an absolute pleasure to be here, so thank you very much for the invitation. And I'm really happy to be here with Blanaid and Dale to discuss these very kind of emergent and exciting topic. What I'm going to do is to reflect a little bit on what's happened over the past 2 years at the University of Cape Town. I thought that might be interesting for people to for me to share some of those reflections, and then I'll move to some of the key themes that I think are shaping and informing the new teaching and learning model. So the University of Cape Town is a traditional research-intensive campus-based university. We have about 30,000 students and about 5,000 staff. I'm just going to try and move. And a little bit about me. As Trine said, I'm the director of the Center for Innovation in Learning and Teaching. We are a teaching and learning center. My personal background is in learning design, in project management, and in working in developing the in-house capacity building for online and blended course development, and developing strategies for digital education in higher education institutions. I also have a research base, and I have conducted research on massive open online courses, MOOCs, open educational practices. I've also been part of a research project looking at how higher education is being unbundled and looking at different business models. And I'm currently focusing research on assessment practices, particularly post-COVID. That's a little bit about me, and the best way of getting hold of me is via Twitter, if anyone wants to get in touch later. So I'm going to do a very quick overview of what happened at UCT, at the University of Cape Town, over the past 2 years, and then what's happening here, and a little bit about the South African context. So as we have all experienced working in the university sector as staff and students, once COVID hit and lockdowns were implemented across the globe, there was a huge pivot online, a huge shift to different forms of online teaching. And in our context, we called it remote teaching. And it was very interesting to me that in many parts of the global north in particular, the teaching methodology was almost shifting to kind of high tech, high bandwidth Zoom, MS Teams type of lecturing online. That was almost the kind of instinctive way of how we could continue with online teaching. In South Africa, for higher education institutions, the transition was very challenging and also quite different. In our context, when students were sent home and lockdowns were imposed, residences were emptied, there was immediate issues around access for students, and it wasn't possible for universities like ours to move to high bandwidth synchronous video technology to replace that classroom experience. So this posed, well, not an interesting challenge, a kind of crisis almost, and immediately social and economic dimensions came to the fore for institutions as well as for students. How could South African institutions deliver for, or continue teaching in these conditions? And I will talk more about my university, but many of the strategies that were adopted at UCT were adopted by other South African institutions as well. But there was a requirement to ameliorate what we might call the digital divide. And so there were some very pragmatic and practical strategies that took place. For example, we provided laptops for students, including couriering them all across the country for students who were eligible. We were also able to negotiate a zero rating for educational websites. That meant that there was a government mandate that access to educational websites, including our in-house hosted learning management system, and the content and data would be zero rated for data cost. That was and continues to be a huge enabler of digital access, for example. Our university also provided internet data bundles per month for students to allow them to keep studying online. And all along with this, there were iterative responses. So there were negotiations with the cell phone companies and so on. So there was, that was really the baseline. And maybe that wasn't the case in countries with a more sophisticated or more equitable digital infrastructure already, but in the South African context, this was really like the starting point for any of this to be feasible, and it continues to be a challenge. The other big challenge was that at our university, our teaching, as I said at the beginning, was traditional in the sense that it's campus-based. We privilege the residential experience. We want our students there. Lecturers lecture in very different ways, not innovatively, didactically, the whole continuum. And we had at the university a nascent blended and online learning program. There have been experimentation, especially with early adopters using digital tools. But broadly, our teaching approach was a more traditional campus-based approach. So we had to really support and shift and offer a set of technical and pedagogical strategies about how to now teach online, or what we called emergency remote teaching. And so we, at our center, we took an approach of saying we were going to call this low-tech remote teaching. And we had a series of do's and don'ts, but effectively what we supported was an asynchronous model of teaching, which is broadly similar to a kind of flipped classroom model. But it was done in a hurry, and it was that we were no longer going to have live in-person lectures. So lectures would be recorded or short. We encouraged lecturers to make short videos. We assisted them and to develop a scaffolded learning pathway using broadly asynchronous methods and modes. And we, at least in 2020, because of the issues around digital access, asked people to be very careful about using live synchronous teaching because of the inequality and access issues. So that was a kind of a huge cultural shift and a huge kind of practice-based shift. So that was what the kind of strategy that we adopted. We also, at the institution level, were able to negotiate and discuss and deliberate a revised academic framework. We realized that the very difficult conditions of studying during a pandemic in circumstances where people's home environments may not be particularly conducive to study, that there were strategies such as reduced weekly workloads for students. In 2020, we had pass-fail rather than grades for the year, because there was a sort of equity issue here. We tried to shift from more continuous assessment and fewer invigilated exams, or in fact no invigilated exams, because it wasn't possible. We also had students, for some students for whom digital access was just not possible. So we had a project that provided paper-based or offline learning materials which were couriered to those students in that time, and so on. So these were the kinds of strategies that in normal times would have really been unthinkable. So that's a very kind of quick overview of of what we did in order to meet an emergency response. As Trine said, that is what so many institutions had to do. Now we're in a kind of reflective mode of what does this all mean? And so 2021, 2022, we have been moving from like the emergency response to more intentional design. And that's, I'm going to talk a little bit more about that. I mean, we're still responding to COVID-19. The pandemic is still here with us, but from 2021 and from this year, there is more on-campus and in-person teaching in what is evolving into a hybrid or blended model. We are also looking towards a digitally enabled future through intentional design of what we're calling, or what I'm referring to as, a teaching and learning ecosystem. What will that look like? What do we need to build? And really, it's about culture and practice as well. It's not about only about the tools and technologies and the models. It's about navigating, having those important conversations about what this new normal or what this new abnormal will look like for the various stakeholders who are affected. So I'm going to whiz through some of the core things that I think that we need to pay attention to, and that we are paying attention to as we negotiate and build towards what the new teaching and learning future at a university like UCT will look like. So first of all, I think what's become very apparent is the role of central structures and services. So UCT is traditionally quite a devolved university with faculties, courses, course conveners, kind of doing their own thing in a sense. But what the pandemic and the kind of scaled up need has shown us the role of central services, structures, teaching and learning centers, and also the role of particular staff such as academic developers, learning designers, instructional designers, technologists has become very well necessary in the emergency and the sort of remote teaching, but also it provides opportunities for building support systems for teaching at the university towards the new teaching models. So for example, tools, platforms, and technologies are now required at scale. We also need to think about or focus on joined up thinking for processes and people. So if we think about the student journey, we need the student journey to be consistent and coherent. And therefore, from registration to graduation, there are so many different processes that perhaps haven't worked together as well, that don't speak to each other either technically or in a kind of coherent sense. So it's that level of infrastructure building, reconceptualizing, rethinking that is becoming more apparent, and that I think really is one of the key aspects for kind of succeeding in this. As Dale and others have mentioned, the use of data and learning analytics for equitable ends. So it's the data is there. What do we do with it? How do we use it? What are the questions that we ask, and how does that impact, for example, course design, student support? And then we are not an online university, and so many universities like ours will continue to privilege the on-campus in-person residential experience. But what does that look like now? And so it's also about repurpose and reimagining physical teaching space if we want to move to more kind of different types of pedagogies. And then what's really become apparent, and I mentioned this earlier, is that the pandemic era teaching has really made more visible existing disparities and inequalities in the student body, especially in the South African context. And it showed us that the study environment, the residences and campus spaces, the devices and connections that the campus provides are a way of leveling up. And so how do we amplify that? What do we put in place to make sure that that stays, but also how do we build more on that creatively? We also, in terms of supporting students, are looking at workload, time management, and some of the unintended consequences of what we might consider good pedagogy. So I was interested listening to Dale, and I would like to pick that up a bit further in the discussion, is that we want students to be more active learners. We want them to do their work beforehand and then come into the in-person classroom space for active learning rather than being lectured at. We want to encourage continuous assessment because it's a formative assessment. All of that puts more pressure on students, puts more pressure on staff in terms of marking. How do we manage that? How do we then recalibrate people's job roles or what our expectations are of students? So I think that's another area of attention now that's come up in terms of consequences of the kinds of strategies that we want to adopt. And then a key element that came out very clearly was that students felt very lonely in the remote teaching environment. They were given the content, they were given the kind of structure and navigate and the pathway to learning, but they really missed their lecturers, they missed their fellow students, they missed the tutors and the infrastructure. But also it's about what does student engagement mean now going forward? So how do we encourage and scaffold students to form learning communities in a kind of participatory ongoing way? And then the other factor around student support is caring pedagogy. So I think this has really come to the fore. How do we look at pedagogies that allow for teaching in the trauma environment? How do we connect with student wellness, with student mental health, which became extremely an important factor in terms of the student's ability to learn during these times. And then supporting academics and teaching teams. What are we going to need here to get to this new teaching and learning model? So staff development, I think a continuum of different types of staff development, both at the point of need, so just in time when staff are building courses or require help, but also all ongoing formal capacity building, such as professional development. And how do we do that? So during the 2020 and 2021, we developed a course for teaching online, which is now a registered short course at our university, which staff can take. And it was built in our learning management system so that staff, perhaps for the first time, had the experience of being students in the learning management system as digital learners. That's a huge shift for a university like ours, for example. So it's that experiential, continuous development, professional learning. I think the other important aspect here is around the need for critical conversations around definitions and concepts. I think what I have learned and continue to learn is that we need to keep having conversations around what do we mean by digital? What do we mean by blended learning? What do we mean by hybrid? We need to be clear about those, but we also need those conversations terms to be negotiated so that there is a shared community of practice. So it's not that we would just parachute in a model or that one size fits all. So I think that's very much the kind of conversation feedback that I get, and also how do we get into the disciplines now in terms of digital learning, teaching, and disciplinary approaches. We've talked about this already, team teaching approaches and the new roles that are emerging in teaching teams. So it takes a lot to put together a blended learning or hybrid learning or sort of new teaching models. And in fact, one of the very interesting conversations I had was when somebody said to me, I think we've really learned the true cost of teaching in this time, because we've really had to kind of grapple with the kind of unbundled nature of it. What does it actually take? And therefore, how are we going to build that into the future resourcing or if we are going to get to where we want to be? And then I think another area here is around promoting the agency of teaching staff to reignite their passion for teaching. There is a lot of tiredness. There's a lot of, I wouldn't say cynicism so much, but a lot of exhaustion, and like, we just can't do much more of this. How much more can we do? So what are the strategies that we can use to build the agency of teachers and to really center the role of teachers in this new environment, that they are so crucially important? What is their role? What is their identity? And then another area which is quite interesting that we're looking at is how to use student feedback in a more ongoing way to inform pedagogical decisions as well. And then really lastly, I think, just on a more general point, I think that we're talking about the future of higher education teaching in a post-pandemic world, but I think we're also having critical conversations about the role of the university itself, and the role of digital technology. And I've just focused on 3 areas that we're particularly looking at. So these have always been on the kind of trajectory of the university in terms of our vision. But I think more because of the experience of the last years, because of the kind of immersive nature, how can we promote or foster inter and transdisciplinary approaches to knowledge creation, which is a core function of the university? How are we going to do research differently? And how does that feed into the teaching project? How are we going to continue to decolonize our curricula and support more equitable and inclusive teaching for student success, which is why we are here in the university? And then another conversation that I'm finding really interesting is to review and develop relevant and contextual graduate attributes. What are the types of graduates that we want in a post-pandemic future from our universities? So a graduate attribute is often, it's not a new concept at all. It's often kind of seen as a slightly kind of neoliberal concept, but there's also something here about what is it, what are the core competencies, or what are the core kind of dispositions that we expect our graduates to have, and how does that then track back into the way that we teach them and the way that we then design our teaching and learning. So I will stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Sukaina, for taking us to South Africa and explaining the context there. And I think that it also reminds us, as in many of our webinar series, that we start from different starting points during this time of pandemic. And it's extremely important to highlight that, because I think that there is even more merit to universities that are situated in contexts where the digital divide is more pertinent, because it was a double challenge of, at the same time, restructuring operations, but at the same time also finding solutions and supporting students and staff in actually getting access to the necessary devices, connectivity, and data, as you said. So it was, I think, even a bigger challenge. So I think that it's fascinating to see how you've been able to make this happen as well, and to support students. And we see that across different countries as well. Here at IAU, of course, when we work with our members around the world. So I wanted to highlight that. And then I think that is also a very important point that you make in terms of the access to the campus for students is a way of leveling out some of the inequalities that we see. So it is a very important, I mean, campus is a very important social part of society that we also need to preserve. That doesn't mean that we cannot explore other opportunities, but it's really something that we need to value as well, the social role of universities. I will now turn to our third and last speakers before we go into the conversation. But thank you already, Sukaina, for your great presentation. Now I'm turning to Blanaid White. Please correct me if I didn't get the name completely right. And she is the Dean of Strategic Learning Innovation in the City University in Dublin in Ireland. And she's leading the implementation of an initiative funded through the government Human Capital Initiative to radically imagine the university curriculum and reconceptualize university teaching, introducing new areas of studies, new ways of learning, and embedding the transferable skills students will be required to thrive in a yet to be defined workspace. I think that's it. But basically, Blanaid, you explained that this was a new position created within the university, more or less at the beginning of the pandemic. So also at a very needed time. Maybe they did not know exactly how much it was going to be needed at the time that the position was created. But now we are very pleased to have you here with us today, and we look forward to hearing about your experience and your thoughts about the future. So you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Trine, and thank you so much for the opportunity to be able to present today. I'm very excited to be joined by my colleagues, Dale and Sukaina, to talk you through the Irish context. And so, as you said, yes, I am the Dean of Strategic Learning Innovation, funded as part of this massive new project that we call DCU Futures. And as you said, DCU Futures is happening now, and it is that radical reimagining of the curriculum. And with myself is Dr. Ciarán Dunn, who's the Transversal Skills Director, who is the second brand new role created. And the exciting part for us in creating those two roles is they're central university level roles. So they're a really strong way for the university to call out very explicitly the importance that it is putting on these aspects of the curriculum going forward. So it was a really important leadership statement from our perspective. And our goals are threefold, and they resonate a lot with what you've heard already today. So the first goal is to prepare our students to thrive in a world that's uncertain. And the image from Erik Johansson that you see here, who's a Swedish artist, is very deliberately chosen because the person at the front has come on a road that's been quite traditional, but in a very deliberate and explicit way, they are deciding what their future will be. And back to what you had mentioned earlier, Dale, they're confined only by their imagination in what that future will be. So our goal in DCU Futures is to equip students with the skill set, the knowledge set, the mindset to be able to take advantage. And we speak a lot about future capability as opposed to future proofing, because as we would view it, future proofing imagines a future and helps our students to develop towards that future. But being future capable, we hopefully are developing in our students the skill sets that they need, that regardless of what the future holds, they'll be able to thrive. And secondly, we need to ensure that our institution is sustainable going forward as well. And it speaks to a theme that's emerging today already too, around what does it mean to be a university now? You have a question, you can approach the internet, you can access information in so many different ways. Of what is our role? And so this is a space for us to deliberately to explore that. And fundamentally from us too, and I imagine it's true for a lot of institutions, we want to be differentiated from our competitors. That in the Irish context, Dale mentioned that Phoenix has 4.9 million people in the city. That's the same as the population of my entire country. And we have 5 new institutions, higher education universities have just been launched in the last year. So this need to understand and be proud and take ownership of the space where we are different to our competitors is a key challenge for us as well. So to quickly introduce you to our institution, so we were formed in 1980, we had 191 students. This is what the building looked like. So you can see the old building is the offices, the middle building is the canteen, and then the kind of funny shaped building is our classrooms. So that's what we looked like 40 years ago. And we were granted university status in 1989, and we built a reputation on being innovative from an education perspective. So what innovation looked like in 1989 was embedding work placements as integral elements into every program that we did. That was nowhere else in the country did it at that stage. And now we've grown massively for us. We're the smallest of the 3 institutions here, but we now have 18,000 students. We've multiple campuses, and not dissimilar to what Sukaina was talking about. We are very proud of how we have the highest rate in Ireland of students who enter from underrepresented groups and who have challenges in coming to university. We're ranked #1 in Ireland in terms of our graduate employability and earning salary actually of our students. We just got announced last week, and 19th in the world. So we're very anxious to give students a skill set where they'll thrive in a work environment. And we want to continue to lead in terms of educational innovation. But Futures allows us to ask, what does that mean for us? So I begin, and you mentioned it, thank you, Trine, it was a perfect introduction, that how this all came about was the Human Capital Initiative, which was a major government initiative, which was before COVID, when it wasn't something we needed to worry about. So the November before COVID, hit, at least in Ireland, we had this call from the government to look at reforming and innovating our third level provision and nationally, and supporting innovation in program design and delivery. And talks about, and so this is why we use the phrase transversal skills, is because it was called out in this initiative, even though it's not a phrase we would choose, around promoting and embedding all those skills beyond a discipline skill set that will allow us a graduate to thrive. So that's our background. And I went back to our proposal back in 2019, and we considered what were the trends that were certainly of consideration for us. And there were 4 of them. The first was around that 4th industrial revolution, and how that technology and data was shaping all sectors that we could see. We were increasingly hearing that student mobility was increasing. We were talking around our current graduates, not equipping them to change jobs, but to change sector multiple times. We were hearing everywhere around how the nature of work and the workplace was changing, as are the skills required, and around the fears around automation and AI replacing jobs. So that's the context before there was ever even COVID, where we started to consider DCU futures. And this was our response to it, was to explore the next evolution in what our students learn, in how they learn, and in how we embed the transversal skills they need to thrive. And like I said, all this is all before COVID existed for us. So new areas of study we explored, we considered around the fact that data and technology were infusing all aspects of our world. We need to transition to that zero carbon economy. In the most holistic sense, we want our graduates to contribute to a sustainable society going forward. And ultimately, our graduates need to have human-centric discipline skills. So that's what we considered in terms of the what. In terms of the how, then it looked around innovations around things like challenge-based learning, immersive experiences, what the online learning and virtual laboratory components would look like. And in terms of transversal skills, then, this was us making explicit, regardless of the discipline, and we have everything from engineers to chemists to geographers to business students, that regardless of your discipline, that students would develop their competence in a range of transversal skills that would allow them to be these eminently employable graduates who would have those fundamentally human-centric skills that would allow them to thrive and be able to navigate in a way that has value to them, that interdisciplinarity that they might choose in their future world. So those are the components, but speaking very strongly to what you've heard from Dale and Sukaina, what we found was in order to be able to do that, we needed to, that's the tip of the iceberg. And there are all the threads and components underneath it that need to change in order to facilitate that. So that's everything from systematically building flexibility into how we accredit programs, how we review them, to massively increasing our staff capacity in terms of how to teach innovatively, in terms of upskilling, employing learning designers, learning technologists, and explicitly calling out at every level that at the heart of our institutional strategy is this ongoing, we called it curriculum renewal, because again, we were mirroring some of the things the government said that they wanted to see, but it's fundamentally that transformative change. And it's only all those strands coming together that will allow us to begin to imagine realizing DCU futures. So if we go back now to the place we're in now, that post-COVID world, hopefully, and we look at what we said were the trends that were emerging or that we needed to consider in 2019, we would still say those are 4 of the biggest components for us. So our take home was that the COVID pandemic accelerated trends, but it didn't create them. And when we consider that statement, then that COVID has accelerated trends as opposed to created those trends, what we consider from our perspective is that means there isn't a going back to before COVID. So we explicitly look to burn those bridges to say that that's not a goal for us, because we are continuing to move forward and moving hopefully to a post-COVID restriction world. And that doesn't mean looking to go back. It means considering that all the trends we've lived through in the past 2 years will continue going forward. And so it means that the trends that have dominated, they're not going away. And while there are multiple of those trends, the one that I've concentrated on for today is that digitalization and that digital transformation space. And when we had that conversation, and we continue to have that conversation, again, emphasizing, even just at a very low level, the Sukaina is around the need for definitions. We found very early on, we needed to define what do we mean when we say blended and hybrid and high flex, and where's our start point and where do we want to go to? So I have with, please see at the bottom, this is Sue Beckingham's slide, it is not mine. And it certainly, it's whether we agree or disagree, this gave us a useful, common understood terminology to have conversations across disciplines and across units. And to begin the conversation where most of my colleagues would have said in person is where we are. But when I asked them around the self-directed space, they would all agree that yes, there are components of that in their modality as well, which allowed me to bring them to a conversation that said, actually, then we're already in a hybrid space. So that allows us allowed us very strongly to move the conversation from old versus new and the understandable because of the weariness and all the challenges that COVID brings for us now to be able to say to colleagues, we want you to do something new. We face near mutiny, but when we say we're operating in this space already and we're looking at further development in this space, it's a much safer conversation to have from colleagues' perspective. But what we learned very quickly on is that we needed to move beyond this as a start point for conversation. And what I would say now that we are a year and a half into our futures perspective, what we're learning is that we no longer start conversations in terms of synchronous, asynchronous, or online or blended. We start from a curriculum design space. Now, we use the ABC Learning Design Framework in DCU because we find that really useful, but it allows us to have a conversation. And within that conversation, then we explore how our online, for us, and again, we would be quite like Sukaina's University of Cape Town, where we'd say the on-campus experience is our prioritized experience, but that an online component is an integral component of that for us going forward. But critical for us is that there are active activities for students. And again, I think that resonates even with what Dale was saying too, where it wasn't just acquire, it's acquire and assess. So that interactive component is critical. And to things Sukaina mentioned almost at the end around that engagement doesn't automatically trigger assessment. So if we found students and staff were burning out from micro assessments across every module, and suddenly there's so much assessment, they don't have time to absorb, to acquire, to reflect, to do all those aspects as well. So having that conversation around what engagement means and what it doesn't automatically mean. And we are saying at this point in our journey that, again, students felt very, very lonely at times. Colleagues felt very lonely at times in what was, I think Ireland had one of the longest lockdowns in the world. It was very draining and challenging for colleagues. So we are saying explicitly, deliberately, that a synchronous academic presence in modules, even if those modules are 100% online, is an integral component that must be preserved to allow that sense of building connections and a relationship and an understanding between staff and students is critical. But ultimately, our take home is that the conversation is so much broader than online versus face-to-face. And we're trying increasingly to ensure that the overall learning experience for students is at the heart of what that conversation looks like. And then finally, I was aware that I'm the last person speaking, and Trine mentioned at the end, maybe to explore what our aspirations might be. And recently, one of the articles that's caught my attention really strongly is this one by Tim Fawns, which came out last month. But if like Sukaina, I'm very active on Twitter, and I've been following this conversation for the last 2 years in that space. And he speaks around, firstly, the illusion that we have that technology is driving the pedagogy and the challenges or the reservations colleagues have with that. And instead, that driving a knee-jerk to actually know pedagogy first. But that too is an illusion where pedagogy drives the technology, and that has its own limitations. So our actuality is far more in this space where we have this entanglement between pedagogy and technology, where things are mutually reinforcing each other. And so the methods, the technology, but also the purpose, the context, and the values are all contributing together. And we explore then the agency of staff, the agency of students, the agency of everybody else in that conversation as well. But at the end of this paper, Tim Fawns talked around what might we aspirationally look towards? And he suggests that we look towards something where we actually begin the conversation in terms of purpose, context, and values, and emphasize those over the pedagogical methods and technology, not to minimize or delegitimize them, but too often they become too big a part of the conversation. So by explicitly exploring the purpose, the context, and the values, and exploring methods and technology in that space, and embracing the entanglement and the dance between both, that's where perhaps that's aspirationally where we want to move towards. So I'm going to stop it there, Trine, and hope that that finishes somewhere you thought would be appropriate for the rest of the conversation.
Definitely. I think that's a very interesting, and thank you, Blanaid, as well, for making the linkages between the different presentations that you were doing, because I think that it's fascinating to see that even though that we are in 3 very different countries, there are still a lot of similarities, of course, also very diverse contexts that needs to be considered, but it is still some of the same questions that we are confronted with, the different lessons learned that we want to take out and see. And I think basically what is common for all of you, what I hear is that, I mean, the aim is to provide quality education to the students for student success. I think that's kind of the common aim. And then thank you, Blanaid, as well, for taking us away from what I have also found a bit a pity sometimes during the pandemic, this dichotomy between face-to-face and online learning. It is instead looking at what do we want to do and what are the different modalities that can work, and one is not exclusive to the other. I think that they're complementary and they can be used in different versions and in different contexts. So thank you to all 3 of you. Let's move now ahead to the conversation, and I encourage you all to ask your questions to the speakers if you want follow up. I see we already have a few. I would like to start by one. I'm lucky I have the floor here, so I can take it, because I think that it's fascinating to see these changes that you're introducing to us here in this webinar. And I'm thinking of something that we saw as well in the recent global survey report that we conducted 1 year into the pandemic, looking at what is the impact of COVID on higher education. And one of the things that we saw across the different regions of the world really was that there is also an experience of an increase of workload for academic, but also administrative staff. Is this something that I was wondering, is this something that you're experiencing as well, and that you're able to tackle somewhat in this transformation, so it does not feel like this change is an add-on to something, but it's actually doing things differently that helps us move towards our aim of providing quality education. So I think I'll take it around the table, and then we'll turn to the questions from you. So please do not hesitate to pose your questions. Dale, do you have a thought on that?
I love the image of the person pulling the road that you used in your presentation. And I think that's where we are right now. We are rebuilding the road. That takes additional resources and additional time. People who were not aware that we were rebuilding the road feel like it's an imposition. So the COVID crisis has basically brought everything front and center. But we do have to recognize that before we can drive our new pedagogical model and our new values and our new approaches here, we have to rebuild that road. So that's the lift right now. And if the institution is not investing in that instructional infrastructure, then you'll continue to hear the frustration from the faculty, from the students, because they just see it as an imposition. You have to be clear about the fact that we are rebuilding. It's going to take additional time and money, and we have a goal. There's a vision for what that road looks like and where it's going.
Thank you, Dale. Sukaina, do you want to come in here as well?
Yeah, I mean, I agree absolutely. This what you said, Trine, about the additional workload, but it's not only workload; it's actually new skills. Yeah. We are expecting our academic teachers to be, multimedia designers and videographers and, all of that. So I think a reality check here about what is possible. So one of the strategies, as Dal mentioned, is investment in the teaching and learning ecosystem so that there is adequate support in the form of learning designers and learning technologists and so on, but also how do they work together? So what processes are required to take people through a course development process? We also use the ABC design methodology that Blanaid referred to. But I think the other thing here is also around incentives. So there has been talk in our university about suggestions such as if people undertake a sort of course design or blended learning design project, that it comes up in it as a sort of promotion criteria, for example. So we also have to look at the incentives around that as well. And that's not as easy as it sounds, because this is, again, changing practices. But again, I think this is pointing to what we're all saying, which is that we really are looking at some wholesale practice change here. And some of that takes time, but I also think that given the experience of the last 2 years, things can happen as well, because we've seen it happen. Thanks.
Thank you. Blanaid, I will also give you a chance to react here.
Thank you. And I completely agree with everything that Dale and Sukaina have said so far. And it's from the future's perspective is slightly different, because this was the plan before COVID came. And we heralded very strongly as a pilot, which has the resources. So we are hiring additional academic staff to give buyout from colleagues to be able to not do some of their normal teaching so they can do this instead. We've hired the learning technologists and the learning designers, and I have no idea yet how we look to upscale that at an entire university level, but at least for now it's a pilot scale and clearly heralded as such. But really importantly, in terms of all that piece of the conversation as well, just fallen out of my head, the thing I was going to say, which is really not useful at all. But I think that the incentives piece is a really strong one. But from the other piece that we've learned really strongly in futures, at least, is we're pulling very strongly where we can from international expertise and best practice. And so we're having colleagues. So we have an international pedagogy advisory panel, which informs back on what our plans are. But we're also asking very deliberate and explicit questions to partner institutions that we have, or even institutions that are not partners, but we see in their vision and what they want to do resonances with what we are trying to do. And so we're continually trying to find calibration points external to the institution. And that can be very useful for multiple levels. For me to be able to say to the senior management, do you realize the scale of the infrastructure that's required to be able to achieve this? So I can leverage it in for conversations to senior management. I can also leverage it in for conversations with colleagues around what the outputs from that transformation can look like. So to me, that's the other piece that I haven't considered today, but I think is really important in terms of achieving our goal is, and conversations like this are critical to that, but the extent to which we can support each other and leverage the experiences of each other to better what we want to do in our home institution has been fundamental for us in DCU, at least.
Thank you very much. I think that's a very important point, and it's also something that we subscribe to a lot here at IAU, where really our work is to bring together peers from around the world to exchange on of course, different topics. Here today, of course, looking a little bit more at the digital transformation, but we cover a lot of different issues. Now, let me turn to some of the questions from the audience. Thank you for participating. Glenn, you were asking, I think this one is to Dale specifically, how greatly or to what extent would the current disappearing of the old or of the disappearing model of education involve eduvation or innovative education? I'm not sure I got the concepts completely right, but Dale, I hope you have had some thoughts on this. And how would either of these two concepts work? So I'll give you the floor for that one.
It is an innovative process. So we need to bring all the creativity that we've heard today to these challenges. When I think about this innovation challenge, I think about it in the context of trying to find a silver lining from the COVID experience. And for us, it has been that the awareness of the need to transform has become universal. And that provides us with a new platform. It's a little bit like taking that first step up. Once there is an awareness that the problem exists and we have options, then the innovation begins. So I would encourage you, whether you're in Thailand or in another country, to start talking about it, really, to bring this topic to your team and ask, where do we begin the innovation process here? What are the constraints we have? What are the opportunities we have? It is, we don't need new terms to describe this. It is a challenge that is what I think of as global. The academic culture across all the different countries has very tremendous amount of similarity. So if we can help each other along the way and develop that new innovative model, then I think everyone benefits.
Thank you very much, Dale. Let me move on to another question. This time it's for you, Sukaina. You have Bea Rodriguez Franzen asking, I really appreciate decolonization of the curriculum. Can you give us an example or success story and how you've begun this process? So maybe you want to elaborate on that?
Thanks. So we at the university, the decolonization of curricula comes under what we call the curriculum change framework, or taking curriculum change forward. And so it's a university initiative, and it's around taking the opportunity when there's curriculum redesign or to encourage and to kind of support the re-looking at curricula based on a number of reasons, one of which primarily for me is around the types of students that we now have coming into the university is much more diverse than previously. And those students need to see themselves in the curriculum. They need to be able to see themselves represented at all levels in the content, in the way of teaching, and what they bring in. So decolonization isn't just about content change or different types of reading lists. It's a kind of process of conversation. It's a change in an ethos almost. So it's not so much that there's a success story and it's finished. It's an ongoing process given where we are, that we started as a kind of colonial era university, and we are now moving and responding and changing to the particular context of the time. And in many ways, so COVID kind of stopped that a little bit because we were just so involved in remote teaching. But I think certainly from pockets across the institution and from this year, and I think Blanaid, you also mentioned it's not really about modality, it's actually about curriculum. It's like, what are you teaching? But in our context, it's very much around giving students a much more culturally relevant, responsive learning experience, which directly contributes to their success. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Very important indeed. Blanaid, another question from still our colleague Bea, who's asking, I love the aspiration of teachers and students collaborating on design and practice. How do you think that this can be implemented successfully?
Thank you. That's a great question, one I'm still grappling with, but certainly for the moment, what we have done in terms of critical for any of the new programs that we're rolling out in futures, they're all rolling accreditations. So we didn't design and lock in years 1 to 4. We designed year 1 and we brought back recent graduates to help inform the design of year 1. And now that we're in year 1, we have a student summit that our quality promotions office manages. So that I'm involved with them, but not necessarily not the academics directly. And we meet once a semester and explore how that semester has gone for them. And then I bring that feedback back to the program chairs, and we have to explore, and this is a critical component of that, is that there has to be feedback to the students that I have to deliver on what's been actioned on the basis of the feedback that they're giving. So that's how we're building it in year on year into the programs, is me as a conduit. And sufficient so the students are anonymous to the colleagues involved, but that the feedback is still brought in a very deliberate way, explicitly, so that it's that ongoing dialogue between the students as a cohort and the program design team.
Thank you very much, Blanaid. So the importance as well of setting up the process that allows for this. Dale, did you also want to comment on this one?
It's all about the process. And student agency is critical here. I think that and whether you're decolonizing curriculum or you're transforming your pedagogy, they have to feel like they're part of this. One of the experiences we had was they rejected the hybrid model in the first year. They absolutely hated it. And part of the reason was nobody explained it to them, and they didn't have any part in the development of the model. And it took us a long time to realize that every time we introduce students to this model, we have to re-educate them on how to learn. So we developed a couple of tools for that worked very well for us, and it changed the conversation to be more positive. One of the things that was most satisfying perhaps was after they finish one of these hybrid courses, they start asking for their next course to be hybrid. So we've followed that as you're describing, Blanaid. You know, you start building from first year, students get accustomed to it. The tragedy in our experience is that for 12 years, they've been told to sit down and shut up in their primary and secondary education. And now we're asking them to get engaged and to be an active participant. So they don't know how to do that. And we have to be patient with them in order to be successful.
Very interesting perspective as well, Dale. I think I will take the next question here, which is also referring to the fact that now that we're moving more to online presence, using different tools, there is also another type of demand in terms of being available at all times and responding individually to demands of students, etc. Is this something that you're reflecting on as well in terms of how to manage a workload? Because it is, of course, difficult to be available 24/7. I think that all humans need rest as well to be functioning normally. So Sukaina, maybe you want to take first.
Sure. Yeah, I don't think it's sustainable in the sense of 24/7 for individual lecturers and conveners. And WhatsApp, we have to remember, is a kind of personal, communication tool. And so from a kind of, governance and university policy point of view, I think that we would have to be very careful to, think about using the social media tools such as that. Although I think pretty much all classes at our university has a WhatsApp class group with class reps and so on. So they do have a very important role to play. But I think in short, it's not sustainable or fair to expect lecturers to be available 24/7. And as a result, we have to think about what central types of services we would need to set up to give that kind of support for students who, we are saying you should work more flexibly, or you should know how to work more flexibly, but we also have to then provide the appropriate scaffolding. That might be in the sense of centralized helpline or chat bots, and looking at some more innovative ways of using tools. Thanks.
And it's similar in your context.
I was going to say that that's specifically why after the end of this year futures, one of the things we're specifically saying is that scheduled teacher presence time is in terms of setting expectations from both a staff and a student perspective in a way that's manageable for everybody. Because we were finding from colleagues that they were feeling under pressure from having to respond at whatever time students sent messages, and equally they feel a great responsibility towards them, so that scheduling the online equivalent of office hours, in addition to everything that Sukaina mentioned, has been really beneficial for our colleagues in ways we didn't anticipate. So back to Sukaina's unintended consequences, that has been very positive for us in terms of managing those interactions and expectations between staff and students.
Yeah, so it's really about managing the expectations, what can be expected. Dale, I suppose that this is also something you've been working on.
Yeah, I think about this as a communications triangle. Primary communication in the past was from faculty or professor to student. And now what we're seeing is the student to student communication exploding. So having a WhatsApp group, we use Slack. There's a tremendous opportunity there, but you have to set clear boundaries. So coming off of the early 2000s when email was first available and students would email professors at all hours of the night, we had to create a new culture, which says that's not going to get a response. So oftentimes we'll see faculty saying, you won't get a response at 3 a.m. Let's be clear. So once you set those boundaries and then you enable other conversations, students can talk to each other at 3 a.m. And that's where we're trying to build. There's a new tool we've introduced to facilitate that. WhatsApp works fine, Slack works great. There are other ways to do it through discussion boards, but giving them an outlet at 3 a.m. is critical to their success, and it doesn't always have to come from the professor.
Very good. Thank you for answering that question. I see that time is flying, so I would like to take a last question now and give you all a chance to respond and a final word here in this webinar, because we have a question from Luz Caballero. Considering all these changes pushed forward by the pandemic, how do you imagine higher education in 2050? And how can we also transform beyond digital changes? So maybe we take a turn on that. Dale, are you up for the challenge of imagining higher education in 2050?
The big change is in the pedagogy. The technology already exists, and we just survived 2 years with the technology. So one of the challenges for us is changing our teaching culture. And we've heard that a couple different times in a couple of different ways. In 2050, I think what we see is a focus on what I would think of as the Socratic method. We're going back to the roots here. Small teams of students and faculty members solving problems and having meaningful discussions. And anything that we do with technology is to facilitate and enable that. So I think about that a lot, because if we're looking for inspiration, Socrates had the small group model and had that focus on developing higher order thinking. We lost that along the way because of our mass production model and our attempt to try to solve the needs of our societies at scale. But I think we can get back to that using the new pedagogy and the new technology by 2050.
So somewhat increasing even further social interaction in a more digital world. Sukaina, what is your view here? How do you see the future of?
Gosh, 2050 seems a long time away as so much change happens. But maybe just in terms of the general trajectory, I feel that the university will become both more porous to the global and the kind of environment around it. Partly because of the power of connections, really, and the way that new pedagogies allow much more of a kind of immersive experience, either for the workplace or for the discipline. So I just think that it will be less contained and more wild. And maybe I'll just stop there, because that's really just what's coming to me now in terms of what the university might become.
Yes, very interesting as well. Blanaid, you get your chance as well here of describing higher education in 2050.
And the aspect that not mentioned in this answer by Dale or Sukaina that I think is also part of it for me is that students will be less blank slate, empty vessel sponges, but rather will be engaged stakeholders who will bring their own expertise to the table. And that will coincide with an increased diversification of what our student cohort looks like. So I'm really excited to move to that place where we are, and that allows them to act more fully in the teams that Dale described and to engage in the way that Sukaina described as well. But I think that I'm excited about exploring increasing the agency of our students in our classroom spaces.
And that, I think, will wrap it up here. I think that I would like to thank all three of our speakers for your fantastic presentations, for your contributions to the conversations here. Personally, I would like to continue and explore many more questions, because I think that it's absolutely fascinating. And I think that it's fascinating to see as well across our differences, some of the similarities that we hear in some of the presentations as well. So thank you, all three of you, for participating and for sharing this. We have recorded this webinar, so we will make it available online. You will have the opportunity to listen to it again if you want to go back and hear some of the presentations. Let me just announce a few activities of the IAU as well. Now that we're here together, we are, even though we continue our online webinar series, also very pleased to remind you that this year we are attempting to meet in person in Dublin. University College Dublin is hosting this conference, and we currently have a call for proposals that is open until 15th of April, so only a few days left. But if you want to potentially just participate or even maybe in the program, please have a look and give your proposed presentation there. We also have an open survey at the moment. We conduct several global surveys, and we have one where we're looking at digital transformation of administrative services, so support services within the university. So that one is open. So please have a look as well and provide input there if you have the time. It will be very interesting to see how things are moving there as well. We have another global survey looking at universities' contribution to sustainable development. So if that's a field that you're very much interested in, please do go ahead and have a look. Basically, you will find all these news in our website carousel when you log on to the main page. So please browse through all these different opportunities and please engage and continue to be engaged. And thanks again to all the speakers for coming to this discussion. We look forward to continuing collaboration beyond this conversation. So thank you for all of you participating. Thank you to the speakers, and I will stop it here. Have a good evening.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.